Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. We have a couple people still coming in from the waiting room, but we're going to go ahead and kind of get started in the interest of time. So I just wanted to say, first of all, welcome to the NC Live Annual Conference. We're super excited to have you join us online this afternoon, and you are in the concurrent session, Addressing Trauma for Archival Workers, scheduled for 3:00 p.m. So my name is Sophie Hollis, and I'm the Community Engagement Librarian at NC Live. And as the moderator for this session, I just wanted to share a couple of things before we get started. So at NC Live events, we value the presence and active participation of all attendees. So by joining us, you agree to uphold the principles of our code of conduct, which can be found on our website. And I'll also put a link to that in the chat if you're interested in looking. In the interest of time, we'll save Q&A for the end of the presentation. So if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A box, which can be found in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen. I'll be monitoring that Q&A and the chat in case anyone needs assistance, but please make sure that you stay muted during the presentation. This session is also being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel after the conference. The presenter's slides will also be posted after the conference if you would like to access them later. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Shira Greer. Shira is pursuing an MS-LS at UNC Chapel Hill. She is a graduate research assistant in the Southern Historical Collection at Wilson Library. Previously, she earned a BA in American Studies from the University of Richmond. Her research interests include community archiving, digital humanities, Black studies, and queer theory. Welcome, Shira.
All right, thank you so much, Sophie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about addressing trauma for archival workers. So sort of the overall guiding question for this presentation is, how do we as archival workers navigate the ways in which archival materials related to traumatic events can cause harm? And I really came to this question through some of my undergraduate research at the University of Richmond. I worked on an institutional history project called the Race and Racism Project, where essentially we were going through university archives, including the student newspaper, yearbooks, sources like that, to really uncover our own institutional history of racism, so that we could then reckon with it. So as you can see here, we have many instances, and many more that I could fit on this collage, of racist incidents that have happened in the university's history, but we found oftentimes that it wasn't being addressed. And so really the goal of the project was just to go uncover these instances and really have a conversation around them. And so through my work with this project, I was sort of introduced firsthand to how archival materials can be difficult and even traumatic to work with. And so based on my work with that project, along with the project archivist at the time, Irina Rogova, who's now the digital initiative librarian at Virginia Commonwealth University, we began to write a book chapter about addressing trauma for archival workers, that'll appear in a guidebook, a practical guidebook to trauma-informed practice, that'll be published with Rowman and Littlefield, I believe in 2025, but don't quote me on that. All right, so just to go over what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to start off just talking a little bit more about what trauma is and how it interacts and manifests in the archives. I'm then going to talk about some feminist approaches to archival trauma and conceptualizing and responding to it. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the current state of research on trauma and information workers. And then I'm going to go through the 6 principles of trauma-informed care and how they sort of manifested in our work with the Race and Racism Project. All right, so starting off talking about trauma and archives, I'm sure we've all heard trauma be discussed, and probably more so in recent years, but I think it can be helpful to just get a little bit of a grounding on what trauma is. So a very short, simple definition for trauma is that it is the deep emotional and psychological effects of a variety of extreme and negative experiences. And so I think, as you can tell, this definition can be very wide-ranging. And that's because if you talk to any sort of psychologists or therapists or people working in this field, What they all generally agree on is that trauma is deeply personal and it encompasses a wide range of experiences. And so, what's traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another. So when we think about trauma, we can also think about it in terms of the three E's, and those three E's are event, experience, and effects. And so the event is the actual event that occurred, whether that be something like a natural disaster, a school shooting, death of a loved one, something like that, the actual event that happened. Then the experience is how a specific individual experienced that event happening. So your own experiences with a loved one dying, a natural disaster, etc. And then the last E is effects, which is the results or the aftermath of the event and how it was experienced. And so those effects can be short or long term. They can also be immediately experienced after the event, or it might have a delayed onset. It could be months or years before people start to experience those traumatic effects. Um, and so when we think about trauma, we can also break it down a little further into three main types of trauma. So the first one is post-traumatic stress, and that's probably what you generally think of when you hear the term trauma. So the stress from experiencing a traumatic event firsthand, being part of, say, a natural disaster, or something like that. The secondary traumatic stress would be the stress from knowing about or interacting with those experiencing traumatic events. And this was really developed as a concept when taking into account the experiences of people like firefighters, paramedics, other emergency responders, and how, over time they weren't necessarily experiencing those traumatic effects themselves, or the traumatic experiences themselves, traumatic events, but they were, coming into contact over and over and over again with people who were experiencing those events, which sort of develops a traumatic response as well. And they sort of term that secondary traumatic stress. And then finally, most recently, we've come up with this idea of vicarious traumatization, which can be defined as stress from indirect exposure to trauma through traumatic materials. So think journalists working with those materials, researchers, and of course, archivists and the materials we work with day in and day out. And so vicarious traumatization being caused through traumatic materials. Traumatic materials, again, can be a little bit of a tricky phrase. So Katie Sloan, Jennifer Vanderfluet, and Jennifer Douglas define traumatic materials as records that document a profound incident or series of events and that cause psychological distress to the person working with or accessing these records. And so, like trauma, this is sort of not a hyper specific definition. It's very wide. It can encompass a lot of different types of materials because, similarly, what constitutes traumatic materials is highly personal and can vary from person to person what they experience as traumatic. So, taking that grounding with, the failures of traditional, or excuse me, uh, the background of traumatic materials. The materials themselves are also housed within, of course, this larger structure of archives, which, as we know, traditionally have been problematic, right? Archives have traditionally denied that marginalized groups have um, any sorts of histories or legacies worth preserving. And so they hold the power to exclude in terms of how they shape narratives about certain groups, and also how they physically don't collect materials oftentimes from marginalized groups, although this is changing. But all too often, marginalized people have only been included in archives for the purposes of surveillance and control and dispossession. And so you can think about examples like the documentation we have surrounding enslaved individuals, right? How that often is from the perspective of the enslaver. We have far fewer records of enslaved people themselves. You can think of records documenting mentally ill people or prisoners, right? They're all from that perspective of the institution doing violence onto these groups rather than the firsthand accounts of the groups themselves traditionally. In addition, archives have traditionally extracted materials from communities to bolster their own institutional standing without creating mutually beneficial relationships with the communities that they document. And so we know materials from marginalized groups often end up in repositories that are far from the communities that they document, and there aren't intentional outreach strategies to make sure that access is provided to those groups that are being documented. And Jarrett Drake also notes three characteristics that make the traditional archive inhospitable to marginalized groups. And those are silence, solitude, and surveillance. And so, as we know, traditionally, and this is, I still think, true to this day, archival research happens in the reading room, where patrons are expected to individually consult materials, whether they be funny or heartbreaking. Um, love Covering topics like love, war, hate, abuse, and joy. But you're sort of expected to consult those materials and display no sort of auditory or effective response. And you're really supposed to experience those individually. It's not like you're typically having conversations in the reading room or going in with a group of people to engage materials. In addition, many archives also surveil users, requiring photo identification, search and inspection of bags or other personal belongings, and monitoring through staff or closed circuit cameras. And these reading rooms are often connected to universities or government institutions that have displaced marginalized communities in their development through the processes of urban renewal and gentrification. And when you think about the materials in many archival collections, typically archival languages, quote unquote, such as English, are predominant in collections, and other languages don't appear, or there are very few materials in other languages, really excluding the amount of knowledge that we have access to. And so, taking that background of trauma and the archives, and thinking about like how materials are situated within the archives and how that can be um, provide a foundation for traumatic experiences, we want to think about feminist approaches to archival trauma. So, taking the perspective of feminist ethics, thinking of feminism as being concerned with the asymmetrical distribution of power between groups and working to lessen or eliminate these unjust power distributions, not just on the binary of men and women, but um, in regards to race, sexuality, etc. We really want to take the perspective of care ethics, which argues that our identities are inextricably bound up in our relationships. And it calls on all of us as individuals to account for our relationships with one another as the sort of moral or ethical test that we live our lives by. And I think that we can really apply this perspective of feminism and care ethics to our work as archivists. So, talking about some of those implications of feminist ethics for archivists, we really want to break away from the idea of the archival worker as this morally good, neutral keeper of the record, and rather think about how our work is sometimes harmful. It's sometimes good, but it's sometimes harmful, because we function as custodians of collective memory. Um, and sometimes we're reproducing harmful narratives in that work, and oftentimes this is based on our own identities, whether that be personal, group, national identities, and they sort of go unexamined oftentimes because we've got this idea that we are neutral and we're just making the information available without attending to how our own identities impact our work. And so that's really important, because if we can't attend to our own identities and recognize and reflect on the ways that they impact our works, then how can we be good stewards of collective memory? And so, really, I think what feminist ethics calls on us to do as archivists is to take responsibility for how we engage in this work to support ourselves as workers so our work can be nuanced, restorative, and sustainable. And so I'm sure we've all read From Human Rights to Feminist Ethics, Radical Empathy in the Archives, or at least heard of it, by Michelle Caswell and Marika Safor. But they sort of really do a good job of demonstrating how um, these feminist ethics can be implemented in our work as archivists through the concept of radical empathy. And so I'll just read their definition. They define radical empathy as a way to engage with others' experiences that involves discarding the assumption that we share with them the same modal space of belonging in the world, and instead assuming that subjects are embodied, that we are inextricably bound to each other through relationships, that we live in complex relations to each other infused with power differences and inequities, and that we care about each other's well being. And so this is really exemplifying that feminist approach to archival work, and giving us ways that we can sort of think about the relationships that are involved in this work and how we show up as we do this work day to day. So now I want to talk a little bit about trauma and information workers and sort of what the current state of literature has been. Like I mentioned before, there's been such a increase in discourse around subjects like trauma and mental health in recent years. And so we're just now sort of starting to research and better understand how trauma and mental health and wellness overall, of course, as the theme of this conference is, really impact our experiences as information workers. So currently, most of the literature focuses on the experiences of front-facing public library workers, particularly their interactions with patrons. So thinking about microaggressions, hostile patrons, things like that. Um, that is sort of where the literature is focused thus far, although there has been some as well on experiences in terms of trying to take on leadership roles, and being recognized by administration um, for how they can deal with uh, different library situations. But then there really is this need for further research on examining how other LIS workers experience trauma. So thinking about academic libraries, um, school libraries, special libraries as well, really doing more research just beyond the public library realm. And so in terms of addressing trauma for archival workers, I know I can say in my experience, and at least for the other LIS workers or archival workers that I know, we don't receive training to address trauma, whether that be traumatic materials, helping patrons work with traumatic materials, processing those materials ourselves. Pretty much, it's something for individuals to deal with. There's no sort of training or discussions at a large scale, whether that be through professional development or orientations in the workplace or even in archival education programs as well. But we know that trauma is an embodied experience that affects mental, physical, emotional, and social well being, and that it can impact archival workers as they prepare archives as well as engage with colleagues and the public. And so that really brings us to this need for trauma-informed care in the archives. All right. So generally, when you talk about trauma-informed care, there's generally agreed upon 6 principles. And the first 5, so safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, and then empowerment, voice, and choice, were developed by Roger D. Fallett and Maxine Harris, clinical psychologists. Um, and they were the ones who sort of first started talking about this framework of principles for trauma-informed care. But then SAMHSA came along a little bit later and added that 6th principle of cultural, historical, and gender issues. Um, and so those are being applied in a wide range of contexts, right? Obviously, psychology, um, therapy contexts, social work as well. But they're even, being included in education, and of course, libraries. And Rebecca Tolley, who I believe spoke Friday at the in-person day of the conference. She wrote a book called A Trauma-Informed Approach to Library Services that was structured around these 6 principles as well. And so her work provides a little bit of a foundation for thinking about how we can enact trauma-informed care in the archives. And so thinking about those 6 principles, I'm going to be discussing them through the case study of the Race and Racism Project that I mentioned earlier. And so just a little bit more of a background on the Race and Racism Project. It began in 2015 at the University of Richmond, and it started out being a faculty-driven project, using coursework, semester-long coursework, to engage university archives and start uncovering and reckoning with the institution's history of racism. It eventually expanded, and a project archivist, who was Irina Rogova that I mentioned earlier, was added to the project. Um, and then they started doing these summer research fellowships, which have now become sort of the bread and butter of the project, its main focus. And those fellowships fund students to stay on campus over the summer and do research related to the institutional history, whether that be in the university archives, looking at the university newspaper, or conducting oral histories with alumni, faculty, and staff of color. And so when I participated in the summer of 2019, I was conducting oral histories, and I had the opportunity to engage with three or lead interviews for three alumni of color, and then I also provided technical support for two other interviews, and ended up producing a podcast from that. And so I did a podcast. Some of the others did digital exhibits. And those have sort of been the main products of the project and how they've been pushing the institution to have that conversation on how race and racism has affected our institutional history, but also present day experiences on campus. So going back to those six principles of trauma-informed care, um, the first one that we wanted to discuss, it was really the foundation, is cultural, historical, and gender issues, while that was sort of the last one that was added to the sort of trauma-informed framework. That's the one that we really felt like was the foundation for this project. So thinking about, as an overarching question, how can libraries and archives actively address cultural stereotypes and biases in the profession, including in collection development, user interaction, and more? So thinking about how we can get students who are engaging in archival research, often for the first time, to understand the field a little bit better, how archives have traditionally functioned, like I mentioned, but also how we can intervene in that, and really chart forward a new, more inclusive and more just way of archival engagement. And so, thinking about how we were going to sort of raise awareness of these cultural, historical, and gender issues in the project, what really stuck out to us was that the project was very much rooted in place. Both the University of Richmond and the City of Richmond, um, which I think was a little bit different for many of us working on the project. The University of Richmond is mostly within the city of Richmond, partly in Henrico County, but oftentimes students for generations have referred to it as the quote unquote Richmond bubble. It's a small liberal arts campus. Almost everyone lives on campus. It's tree lined, surrounded by, wealthy neighborhoods, things like that. And so oftentimes we'd get so sucked in to being part of the University of Richmond that we weren't necessarily thinking about the city of Richmond, the state of Virginia, those larger contexts. So really we sought to counter that perception in the project through grounding it in local and national history as preparation for diving into the archives. So thinking about not only the university's history, but the rich history of the city of Richmond, of Virginia, of the nation, and interrogating, different historical themes such as lost cause ideology, that really affected what we saw in the archives. And another way we did this was through connecting to others doing restorative history work in the area, like Free Bangura of Untold RVA, which seeks to illuminate Black history in Richmond. Um, and the leaders of the project archivists and the faculty lead, were also very cognizant of their own identities in leading this project, both being white women. They really wanted to be intentional about partnering with faculty and staff of color, and community members as well, I should say. But really thinking about how the limits of their own perspective and how they could sort of broaden what we were being exposed to by making those really crucial partnerships. And so those were some of the ways that we addressed the cultural, historical, and gender issues within the project. The next principle, well, we actually sort of merged two together. We merged safety and then trustworthiness and transparency because for us, the way we conceptualized it, the way we were creating a sense of safety was through being trustworthy and transparent. So, sort of the guiding question we were thinking about was how can libraries and archives promote physical, psychological, and cultural safety and create a culture of trustworthiness and transparency? And so in Tolley's book, she says that trustworthiness boils down to our actions matching our words, values, and beliefs. Building trust begins with establishing and maintaining credibility, reliability, and intimacy. And so those can be, I think, very heady concepts that might be a little bit hard to approach, but it was even just the small things I think that can really make the difference in promoting that sense of safety and trustworthiness and transparency. So one of the just very simple things that we did was when we met as a group, the student researchers, faculty lead, project archivists, and then our faculty mentors as well. One of the things we always did was just simply arranging tables and chairs in a circle, and really creating a space where there wasn't like somebody was standing up instructing everyone, but really we were all sitting down and discussing together. And so just even how we arrange our physical space can be impactful in terms of elevating everyone's perspective, and making sure that some people don't feel devalued based on their status, really trying to counter that instructor-student hierarchy. Another thing that was really important was being transparent about what collections contain and the emotions that they may evoke. And so one thing Irina did a really great job of was being familiar with the collections that students were going to be working with, and letting them know that, of course, they might encounter traumatic materials in there. And also the university archives are a little bit different than most in that the University of Richmond, their libraries don't control their archives. It's actually a separate organization called the Virginia Baptist Historical Society. And so they're on campus, but it's not university staff running it. And so in that space, there were things like paintings of enslaved people, in religious contexts. There were also staff members who were making disparaging comments towards faculty and students of staff of color. And so she would let students know that, that space might not always be the most welcoming, and that the collections might be hard to deal with as well. But just really being transparent and willing to have those conversations, that there are difficult materials, and just even being willing to name that is really important, because I think a lot of times it doesn't get discussed. And so that can just be one thing about being very upfront in your knowledge of collections and recognizing that they may take an emotional toll on users. Also, we wanted to think about how we, as archival workers or archival workers in training as students, we're creating a space where we could feel safe to make mistakes, say the quote unquote wrong thing, to really learn and grow together, to co-create this sense of safety, trustworthiness, and transparency in our meetings and interactions with each other. The next tenet is collaboration and mutuality. And so thinking about how libraries and archives can promote shared decision-making, respect, and communal participation in archival collections. And so one of the ways that we did this in the project was really being intentional about making connections with community partners. So Free Bangura, like I mentioned, but also Chioki Ianson, who's a radio producer for NPR, and also collaborating with and doing intentional outreach to alumni and staff that students wouldn't necessarily come into contact with otherwise. A lot of the alumni we recruited for the oral histories were ones that hadn't necessarily been the most engaged with the campus since graduating. So, we were able to interact and hear from a lot of alumni that we wouldn't have otherwise. We were also able to work with some staff members who, you might not see on a day-to-day basis, right? Behind the scenes library workers, also admin assistants for, if you're not in a specific department you might not know of, but really just making those connections and trying to highlight community expertise. So really just decentering this idea that academia and professors and quote unquote professional researchers are sort of the gold standard of knowledge production, really thinking about the different forms of knowledges that can arise from community members and their own lived experiences. And also just taking the time, being intentional about space for collective brainstorming, editing, and reviewing. So with, like I mentioned, we were all working on these individual podcasts and exhibits, but really being intentional in the ways that we meet up to collaborate and review each other's work, which I think as archivists, we all have so much on our plates, and our work can often be isolating as we all get caught up on our individual projects and don't necessarily take the time to collaborate, brainstorm together. So really trying to break that and make collaboration a core feature of our work. Next, we have peer support. So thinking about how libraries and archives can be intentional about creating space for peers, which we define as hierarchical equals, to share their advice, experiences, and expertise in a voluntary, non-judgmental, empathetic, respectful, and reciprocal way. So, as I mentioned, as I'm sure many of us have experienced, archival work can be very isolating as we all get working on our individual projects, getting sucked in, not necessarily carving out those spaces to connect with others and support one another. So with that, peer support really has to be intentionally fostered, and that's one thing that we definitely noted on the project. And some of the ways that we sort of created that space where we felt like we could support one another was grounding in shared values, community norms that we sort of came together on at the outset of the project and had some different readings and discussions to really give us all a shared foundation of the perspective we were using to ground our approach to the archives. And so really just having that dedicated time and space for connections and talk with each other was really crucial to building that sense of peer support that we could rely on each other as students as we embarked on what was, I think, many of our like first initial research or archival journey. But peer support is, not just supporting, being, say a yes man, but challenging one another as well, and really pushing one another to be the best that we can be, create the most nuanced work that we can as we engage with the archives. And I think that's one thing that's really important about peer support is working to challenge one another, not necessarily having it come from, say, a supervisor, someone in a position of power over you, but as peers on a similar playing field, being able to push each other in that work and really develop your own sense of agency and ownership over your work. And finally, the last tenet that we wanted to talk about was empowerment, voice, and choice. And so, thinking about how libraries and archives can promote a sense of communal ownership and create spaces where everyone's experiences, opinions, ideas, concerns, and advice are heard. And so, really, we just wanted to create a space where workers felt empowered to share what they're working on and what they're learning, to ask for help when needed, to get others' opinions, make their work as good as possible. So that was really important. And I think another thing that went into that was being sure to credit individual labor, including the labor of student workers, whether that be on things like finding aids, exhibits, metadata. Oftentimes I think, it's just, say, the University of Richmond or the University of Richmond libraries that are credited for things like that. But really taking the time to credit and acknowledge each individual person who put in work towards that product, which also helps with transparency as well, right? Being able to know that person, what their positionality might be, what affected the decisions they made in processing that archival collection, selecting subject headings, things like that. Because again, archives aren't neutral. We are not just the neutral gatekeepers of knowledge, right? We all have different factors of our identities that affect us. Another thing was being sure to make decisions across hierarchies, which is particularly important, I think, when thinking about student workers or early career workers as well, to really empower them to be able to give their own opinions and be part of that decision-making process. And so one of the things Irina talked about was how the project started using the subject heading blackface in 2016, which was 3 years before the Library of Congress started using that in 2019. And that really came from having those discussions, empowering students to put in their opinions and advocate for that just as much as any full-time degreed Master of Library Science as well. And so finally, that sort of goes into being sure that as supervisors, it's they're providing intentional supervision, so giving their supervisees the opportunities to choose the skills that they would like to build and choose the output of their work. So in this project, it looked like maybe doing podcasts, maybe choosing to do an exhibit, um, choosing the subject headings or metadata that were used for individual items that we're adding into the collection, right? Just really trying to emphasize agency um, and allowing workers, particularly, part-time or student workers, early career workers, the time and space to really build their experience in the way that will best help them achieve their next steps, their next goals. All right, so that is taking me to the end of my presentation, but I really just want to give you all a few key takeaways. The first one being that archival workers at all levels have the ability to begin implementing trauma-informed practices. So a lot of the things that I mentioned, like the peer support, the collaboration and mutuality, the safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, so much of that work is in the small things, right? It's having those conversations, being intentional about creating communities of practice where we're all grounding together um, and working to be honest about the nature of the materials we're working with and really come together and strategize what the best ways to engage this material is, how we're going to present it in our collections. And that's something that can be done at any level, whether student workers, early career workers, right? Just coming together and having those discussions and being mindful and reflexive about our work is really important. Again, we really focused on students in this chapter and early career workers, thinking about how they're sort of the next generation of archivists and thinking about how if we start to implement this culture now, it'll really become embedded in how all archival workers um, approach their work and really trying to do it in a way that is honest and nuanced and restorative in a way that sort of counteracts those historical injustices that we see so often in our collections. So again, in our project, and I think in some of the projects I'm working on now at UNC, really thinking about and taking historical, cultural, and gender issues as the foundation to our work, and always keeping those in the forefront of our minds in terms of thinking about the historic injustices that archives have perpetuated and how we can use our work now to really counteract those and chart out a better future. Again, we really wanted to focus on diverse lived experiences and knowledge bases to do more nuanced work as archivists and to stop perpetuating the idea that, only the great men of history are the ones whose accounts we should be reading or the ones that are most highlighted in our collections. How we can really think about including community workers, community experts, including their expertise, partnering with them as we build out or reinterpret collections is really important work. And then finally, again, just foregrounding the importance of building those relationships, whether those be with community partners or donors, or our relationships with one another as archival workers. Just really remembering that relationships are the core of our work. And that they really structure how we approach our work and the good that we're able to produce through our work. So with that, I just wanted to end with a photo of the cohort I worked with that summer on the project because, it was only through that group coming together as a community of practice to really grapple with these difficult histories and how, we wanted to engage archives differently, sort of chart out that new way of engaging archives in a way that is trauma-informed and restorative towards those historical injustices of archives. All right, so that brings me sort of to the end. And thank you so much for listening. And I'd love to answer any questions you may have.